All right, good evening, everyone. You guys can close those back doors. We're anyway. Hi, I'm Melanie McNair. I'm the Senior Director of Public Programming here at the Center for Fiction. How many of you are visiting us for the first time this evening? Okay, a few of you. Welcome. We're the only literary nonprofit that focuses on the creation and enjoyment of fiction. And part of the way we do that is through these really fun conversations like we're going to have tonight. So follow us on social media and sign up for our newsletters, and you won't miss out on anything. Um, and for those of you who have been here over and over again, welcome back. And I just wanted to point out that the cafe and bar now has a new menu, and they are doing more food items during the day. So if you ever come here to write during the day, you can eat lunch. A few housekeeping announcements. We will have an audience Q&A tonight, and if you're here, please raise your hand, and one of our fabulous interns will bring a microphone to you. That's so that the people who are joining us via YouTube can also hear your question. And if you're on the live stream, you may type your question at any time in the chat. When the event is over, you can go to the bookstore and purchase the books and then come back in this room to line up to get the books personalized. Both Elliot and Christine were kind enough to come early and pre-sign the books, so if that's good enough for you, you're all set to go. All right, let me introduce our guest. Elliot Ackerman is the author of the novels Red Dress in Black and White, Waiting for Eden, Dark at the Crossing, which is a finalist for the National Book Award, and Green on Blue, which was a finalist for the Dayton Literary Peace Prize, as well as the memoir Places and Names, and is the co-author with Admiral James Stavridis of the bestseller 2034 novel of the Next World War. Ackerman is both a former White House fellow and Marine and served 5 tours of duty in Iraq and Afghanistan, where he received the Silver Star, the Bronze Star for Valor, and the Purple Heart. And Christine Grillo is a writer and editor covering food systems, agriculture, and climate change, whose nonfiction has been published in outlets such as the New York Times, The Atlantic, City Lab, Audubon, Next Tribe, and Real Simple. Her short fiction has appeared in Story Quarterly, The Southern Review, and Lit. Hestia Strikes a Match is her first novel. And Christopher Bea is the editor of Harper's Magazine. He's the author of a memoir, The Whole 5 Feet, and the novels Art and Entertainment and What Happened to Sophie Wilder. His latest novel, The Index of Self-Destructive Acts, was nominated for the 2020 National Book Award. He's currently writing an intellectual history of atheism for Penguin Press. He's writing it right upstairs in the writer's studio. And I neglected to say a huge thank you to Harper Magazine for being our co-presenters tonight. So with that, let's welcome them to the stage.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for coming. It's really nice to be doing in-person events again and having so many people sitting so close to each other in this space. So I was saying to Christine and Elliot upstairs that these sorts of conversations are so often about a book's themes, because a book's themes are sort of easier to talk about. You don't spoil any plot points, etc. But most writers don't write books to be delivery systems for themes. They could just write an essay for that. They're trying to create a sort of an experience for the reader. And it's really interesting to be talking with these two writers about these two wonderful books, which I've spent a lot of the last week delighting in, because they share so many themes, such that if you just talked about the themes, they would seem like the same book. And they're entirely different reading experiences, and really delightful ones. The primary thing they share in common is their alternate history novels set in radically different political situations in the United States. But one turns that backdrop into a really, really delightful romantic comedy, essentially. And the other turns that backdrop into a kind of almost techno-thriller mystery. And they're just both wonderful, wonderful books. So we're going to talk a bit about them, and then Elliot and Christine are going to read from their books, and then we will open it up to you guys. The first thing I'm going to ask each of you is just to say a little bit about the alternate world that you've created for the book.
Sure. So my book opens in 2023 when the Civil War the second Civil War in America has officially begun. And that's sort of the backdrop for the searching that the narrator does for friendship and love. And so the 12 states have seceded from the United States of America, and they call themselves the New Confederated States of America.
Not the Confederacy.
They don't call, well, they're unofficially called the Confederacy. But, and yes.
Great to be with you all. Thanks for joining us, Chris. So Halcyon opens in an alternate 2004. And in my alternate 2004, I imagine that Clinton kept tapes in the White House like Nixon had. He was convicted and so removed from office, and Gore became president for 1 year. And with the advantages of an incumbent, he was able to edge out Bush in Florida and become president in the year 2000. And so what my alternate history plays with is that in the year 1999, that's when we mapped the human genome. What actually happened was when Bush came into office, he, due to his religious beliefs, rolled back a lot of the research into the human genome, sort of slow-rolled it, particularly around issues like cloning. So in my alternate 2004, with Gore as the president, we've gone full steam ahead from 2000 to 2004 with this research. And in the opening pages of the book, you realize that the administration has figured out a way to bring people back to life through a process they call cryoregeneration. And hijinks ensue.
Well, one question again for both of you is, what made you decide on this form? Was it something that intuitively happened, or was it something where you sort of abstractly said, I want to be exploring certain things about, both of the books, I should say, talk a lot about, for obvious reasons, about how divided American culture and society is right now along these partisan lines. And both have people who are trying to transcend those divisions with more or less success. I'm wondering whether you started with that kind of idea in mind, or whether you just sort of intuitively as a writer worked into this world.
Well, I started writing this in the middle of the Trump administration, and so I was grappling with a lot of the ideological divisiveness I was seeing. And I was hearing pundits pretty much every day saying, are we in a civil war? Are we headed toward a civil war? And I think when I started writing, I realized quickly, this is very grim and depressing. I don't want to write a grim and depressing book about something that's grim and depressing. So I took a different tack and thought, well, what would life really be like? I've never lived through a war that's being fought on my turf. So what would it actually feel like? And so it was a sort of a thought experiment for me. How would life feel day to day? Everyone still has to go to work and get their car fixed and mow their lawn. And so what is how does the dramatic conflict of war and the tedium of everyday life, like what's the mesh? Where do they bump up against each other the most? And I think that was in relationships. Right? Like you're still going to mow the lawn if you can get the gasoline. But yeah, the relationships. It quickly became obvious that was a good way to tell the story.
If I can stick with you for a second. It's interesting to hear you say that you started it during the Trump administration. Mm-hmm. These characters aren't named, but if I understand it correctly, roughly what happens to set off the Civil War is Biden dies in office, Kamala Harris becomes president, mm-hmm. and a large part of the country so rebels at the idea of a woman, and in particular a woman of color, being their president, that they just won't accept the peaceful transfer of power.
That was the
So
bridge too far.
yeah,
Yes.
so that obviously was not your, because in as Elliot was saying about his book, the way the plot unfolds very much depends on this particular counterfactual turn.
Right.
Whereas it seems like it's a very interesting and thematically rich precipitating event for the Civil War, but you obviously were thinking about a Civil War before you were thinking that this was starting.
Yeah, I was. And I had a couple of different scenarios for what set off the Civil War. I had crazy assassination scenes, and then, it's not really about that. It's not really about how we got there. It's more about what it feels like now that we are here. So I tried to make it more benign, and Biden will die someday. Hopefully not in office, but um, and it was just served up right there. It was just waiting.
How about you, Elliot? How did you?
My process for writing books is like a lot of times your subconscious is writing chunks of the book, so you can only, in retrospect, psychoanalyze not only yourself but the book and say kind of how it came into being. So, if you'll indulge me, I'll engage in a little bit of that psychoanalysis right now. So one of the last things I did before the pandemic was my wife and I had a mutual friend who was having some health challenges, and he was supposed to go on one of these like Wim Hof cold plunge retreats with a friend, and that friend bailed on him at the last minute, and he asked me if I would go. And so I'm like sort of always up for anything, and I had the time to do it. I was like, yeah, I'll go with you. So I found myself like, anyways, up in the mountains, like jumping into like freezing cold water in February of 2020. So there is a cryoregeneration theme in this book. I'm like, maybe like that's where that came from, the fixation on cold. But as I was like 5 days into that process, so my wife's mother and father had a pretty significant age difference. And so he was a veteran of the Second World War, died in 2008. I never met him. But he is, beloved in her family and beloved in that community. And just as I became part of her family, there was always just sort of this refrain as we would open a newspaper, talk about whatever was going on in the world. Well, what do you think Daddy would think about X? Or what would he think about Y? And I regretted that I never met him. So I had, towards the end of that trip, this like very, very intense and vivid dream. It's one of the most intense I've ever had, where he and I were just sort of sitting and talking about everything that was going on in the world. And so I sort of came out of those experiences with this sort of desire to like, I wonder what, not him, because it's not about him, but like, what was sort of a person who was beloved in their own time? How would they navigate our times and the shifting morals of our times and the shifting expectations of our times? And so I was interested in that question. And then, again, talking about kind of like the framework you're setting up from a book, I'm like, well, I don't feel like I want to set it like plunk right now. And by, this point, we're kind of a ways out. So, political life in America is like at volume level 57, like way up. And I was like, well, what if there's, I'd always been interested in this little counterfactual about the Gore administration. I was like, what if I like set it back in, 2004, which to me felt as close up to present as you can get without it being contemporary and being able to say like it's actually history. Like, we look like that is actually history now. So I sort of set it there and then tried to introduce questions and themes that I think are sort of occurrent, and imagine this character, how he tries to navigate them, and that becomes sort of much of the arc of Halcyon.
It's very sweet, all those scenes where the narrators tease the elder. Yeah, very sweet.
Yeah, I like it good night. This intergenerational relationship is a big part of both of the novels. In the case of the narrator and this older character, where he's renting a cottage on his property, but in the case it is a parent and daughter relationship. There's this conflict of feeling like someone who, well, it's in the case of your novel, someone you admire, but in ways that are clearly no longer acceptable and can't it out. In the case of yours, it's much more complicated daughter relationship. There's part of it is that these people who aren't bad people, but they seem to be taking the side of the bad.
I think that was something that for me personally was really hard to grapple with. Sort of like in 2016, I think a lot of things just, wait a minute, is this who we are? Is this is? And I have some very conservative people in my family, and they're not the stereotypical conservative Republicans. They're fairly educated and fairly compassionate people, and they love they're very loving in their own ways. So I did try to create these characters in the parents who went against expectations, maybe because it's so easy to create a stereotypical conservative Confederate. And I wanted to show that there's a lot of nuance to all these, it's not just two different ideologies, it's 1,000 ideologies. And so they struggle.
And one of the disagreements seems to be between Hestia and her parents is part of their take on all this is just like, this isn't such a big deal. You don't have to make such a big deal out of it. When there's literally a civil war going on and they're moving, from the Union to the Confederates across the border to a hostile nation and saying, why are you making such a big thing about this? And similarly, there's moments of, sometimes real comedy in your novel about like literally these three children's father has been brought back from the dead, and they're squabbling over inheritance and things like that. And both, it seems, sort of thematically, you're dealing with how we can normalize really wild things very, very quickly, which is also obviously part of what our experience of the last 4 years has been about.
Yeah, I think it's also sort of about trying to keep up. Like, life and norms are shifting so quickly these days. I mean, I hope anyone who would pick up this book would feel empathy for these characters who are imperfect, but who are also in their ways, like they're trying to keep up, like they're doing their best to keep up. And like some people do a good job keeping up, some people don't. And I think the book is also about sort of the hubris of anyone believing that morals are fixed, because they're always shifting. And so as much as there's a temptation to believe that the morals in our time are this final enlightened destination that we've arrived at, be careful if that's your conclusion. You might find yourself like Robert Abelson, the protagonist of this novel, and resurrected through cryoregeneration trying to keep up. So,
in the case of Hestia's parents, what they're resisting is precisely this idea that they have to constantly keep up.
Right. I think you said it really well. We're thinking, what is the big deal? It's fine. Can everyone just calm down and relax? We're fine. Just being in denial that things are going to change and that things might have to change. That's the really hard part.
Another really interesting overlap between the two books is they're not just alternate histories. They're very interested in historiography, meta histories. So your narrator is a historian. And Hestia is engaged in this oral history project at this retirement community where she works. And both of them, at much greater length in Halcyon, but also in Hestia 6 and F, get into the disagreements in how we historically remember the First Civil War, or the Civil War, depending on which novelist they put it, and those questions of how we tell history and what meaning we tell history is.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I think that with regards to particularly like wars and civil wars, sometimes we feel as though there has to be one story. And like what was I'm not just speaking on our Civil War, but like what is this war about? And if you say it's about something else, that is, you're wrong. Well, the fact of the matter is, like, the fact that you have two sides who cannot agree about what the war is about is the reason you're fighting the war. Like, if everyone agreed what the war was about, you wouldn't be fighting the war. So I think that, I've worked as a war correspondent. When I was covering the Syrian civil war for a number of years. If you would sit down with someone who was fighting for the Free Syrian Army in a conversation, if you talk to them about the civil war, they would get very upset. They'd say, no, this is not a civil war. This is a revolution, my friend. And then you talk to someone who supports Assad and you talk about the revolution to them, like, what revolution? This is just a civil war. And the same holds true for, I think, throughout any society. And so ultimately, history is trying to, for all times, reconcile a single narrative. And there are fights about it that persist well after the events themselves. So, yeah.
Tell us about the role that this oral written history project plays.
Before I do that, I just want to say that there's this portion of your book toward the end where the narrator reflects on how he's in that position of luxury to be an observer about the Civil War because he didn't have people. It's not his history because he wasn't. I think that was so interesting because I realized that I had done the same thing. Writing about Civil War.
No, I think it's in both of our books. We landed in many of the same places, and I think based off of the strong historical strands and the fact that many of the characters are much older, I feel like we should also be bowing to get these in the AARP and tier lists. So if anyone's out there,
They're also both books are set in these Atlantic states where maybe there is still more of a ongoing fault line because the injustice as opposed to people in the Deep South have a very clear idea what the war was about. People in the Northeast have a very clear idea what maybe in places like Maryland and Egypt. It's a bit of a
And I think the idea that the war is, I lived for many years in the South, and you really, I don't know if either of you actually have lived in the South, but you feel it's alive down there and has a pulse in a way that it does not if you live, Boston, for instance.
I grew up in Richmond, and I literally did have neighbor boys asking if we wanted to
So we'll turn to this the oral history, which plays in.
In the book, Hestia, the main character, is working with a few of the retirees in the city, getting them to do scribbles, and it's an oral history project. And I was really inspired to do that because I think it was during the pandemic. There was a lot of I just kept seeing ads for buy your parents, buy your grandparents these oral history kits. And then the people would record their answers and a legacy that they could pass on to their children. And I would look up some of these prompts, and they were all tell us about your favorite thing about your wedding day, and tell us your favorite moment with your children, and they all had this very rosy, painted a very rosy picture. And I thought, which is so interesting because when you tell history, so much of it is about the questions that you ask about that history, what you want to know about. And if you only want to know about happy marriages and the wonderful children and wonderful vacations, then that's what you'll hear about. But so these villagers were a little more ornery, and they didn't have any of that heteronormative history. So they wrote their own poems.
By the end, they get quite existential, really.
Yeah. And they have a lot of wisdom that they want to share. Get to that age and be amazing.
Now that we've gotten a general sense of the background of the books, this may be a good time to read them. So maybe if your mic is not working, you've got to read, or if you're fine. If you don't mind holding while reading, I just...
I don't mind.
Yeah, just go ahead.
Just do a couple pages. This is just the very first couple of pages of the book, so I don't think I really need to explain it. 2 months after the war began, I found myself single, abandoned. I was shaken, a little manic, already lonely. I dipped into the new-to-me online dating world, and before I could really figure out how the apps worked, I unwittingly flirted with guys from the other side. I even went on a date with one. The fact that his profile mentioned the word freedom so many times should have tipped me off, but he was nice-looking, and let's be honest, loneliness is its own form of brain damage. Some apps screamed out the Confederates, so I started to use those exclusively. Within a few months, I had a short list of men who had herded me back, whose grammar was good enough, and who seemed like solid unionists, not too fanatical. I wasn't exactly looking for the love of my life, or maybe I was. Per usual, I didn't really know what I wanted. I knew that I didn't want to fall hard for anyone, because I could still remember that when you fall hard for someone, everything is awful. You don't sleep. You ask yourself too often, does he love me? Am I sexy? Am I interesting? It's nice to have new relationship energy, but it's a lot to manage. I was neither sick enough nor well enough for that kind of nonsense. Then I saw Ethan's profile, and I thought, this could work. In his pictures, he looked fit and handsome with wavy hair, but I knew I wouldn't be in danger of falling too hard because he'd written, I'm doing my utmost to live life to the fullest. Live life to the fullest isn't the worst thing a person could write, and it's less grating than, say, work hard, play hard, which for some reason is something men brag about. It was utmost that reassured me. In my 30s, utmost would have been a hard pass, but at 42, it was a point in his favor. Utmost nearly guaranteed that I wouldn't do myself the disservice of falling head over heels, as they say, which might be fine for people who are less clumsy than I am.
So I will do the same and kind of read the opening of the book. So, news of the great discovery trickled out. Resurrection, new life, had become a scientific possibility. The story ran below the fold in the Richmond Times-Dispatch on an unseasonably cold Sunday in April. 2 narrow columns of text described how a team of government-backed geneticists had leveraged findings from the recently mapped human genome to regenerate cells in cryopreserved mice. Weeks and even months after death, they were resurrecting these mice. I had read about the Lazarus mice in a rented guest cottage nestled in the foothills of the snow-capped Blue Ridge. My reason for coming here was to escape, among other things, the relentless binges of breaking news that over the years had quietly subverted and replaced what was once known as the national conversation. The history department at Virginia College, where I taught, but have since left, had granted me a semester's writing sabbatical along with a healthy allowance. After finishing the Times-Dispatch that morning, I pitched it into the stone hearth at the cottage's center, where a half-burned backlog still glowed. That is, I pitched all of it except the story on the Lazarus mice. I held on to that, choosing to save it for later that day, when my landlord, Robert Abelson, would come around for one of his early evening visits. These visits proved a pleasant interlude after tedious, unproductive hours spent alone at my desk. I had rented the cottage from Abelson's wife, Mary, who was more than 20 years his junior. This age difference, he admitted, had proven quite the scandal amidst the prudery of decades past. Less so now. Mary was an old soul, and Abelson was anything but, which caused her to joke that he was, in fact, her younger man. Handsome in a minor key, with clear bluish-gray eyes and carefully groomed hair still flecked with strands of reddish-brown, his appearance belied his 90 years. His face was high-boned, his cheeks rosy and vital, his features distinct. He would have been a natural for caricature, except caricature freezes, and his face was a paradigm of fluid expression. He was possessed by a vigor that he insisted was the result of his daily walks. He called these his constitutionals. It was after these constitutionals that Abelson would typically pay his visit, mixing us each one of his signature 4 olive martinis, and we would settle in on the cottage's lumpy furniture. Our talks would range in topic, animated by a collision of interests. My work, a study of postbellum attitudes on the Civil War, his life, service in the Second World War, a career as a prosecutor, and the behind-schedule and above-budget renovation of the property's main house, a white brick neoclassical with a wraparound porch they called Halcyon. The name itself linked to the estate for as long as anyone could remember and conjuring a nostalgia for better days. We'd drain our glasses and the hours would pass while we exchanged our drink-inspired truths. Inevitably, the conversation would turn to the headlines, which is why that evening I had saved the story about the mice. Before I get to Abelson's reaction to those mice, the year itself, 2004, is a necessary digression. That year and the confluence of forces harnessed to create its zeitgeist are as much an actor in Abelson's story as any one person. For those of us who lived through it, we could remember that it was a time when a frenzy pervaded our national psyche, with its liberal and conservative personalities conspiring against our collective sanity. From the political left and from the political right, America had learned over the years to binge on scandal, the Clinton conviction, on piety, September 11th, and on wrath, bin Laden's body dragged from a cave in Tora Bora on Christmas Day. We had lost our ability to disaggregate our values from our rage. Opinion mattered, accusation mattered. In recent memory, had there been a greater epoch of either? Had there been a time when a single word, anonymous or otherwise, possessed greater potential to undo the old order on which we'd once relied? Destruction and creation were in the air, and so had there been a greater time of freedom? Didn't our flawed society need to evolve? And, if we did evolve, would any of this associated destruction have been wrong? We didn't know. Anything could happen. Nothing was sacred. All thinking became absolute. We congregated to the poles of leftward and rightward consciousness. We hollowed out the center of our political life, unraveling the braid of our societal obligations to one another, only to awaken and realize, with wonder, that none of those obligations were, or ever had been, any stronger than a single strand of thread. It was on those threads that Abelson's life would come to depend, but that night the story of the mice was foremost in my mind. Had it appeared in the paper 5 or even 10 years earlier, in a different time, which is to say a saner time, I wonder whether Abelson would have regarded it with such hostility. Once he'd finished reading, he handed me back the page with a flick of the wrist. Utter nonsense, he'd said, as I took it from him. Did he think the report was a fabrication? Martin, he added, I haven't survived the better part of a century by believing every word put into print. The doubt he'd introduced into something I had so readily believed left me feeling a tinge inferior. He went on. You have to be careful with these scientists. They get their jollies playing God. I knew from other conversations that Abelson wasn't a particularly religious man. On a different night, after he'd lingered over too many martinis, that weighty subject had come up. I confessed to Abelson that although I was born Jewish, I no longer practiced and wasn't sure I even believed in God anymore. But I also knew it felt wrong to say God did not exist. When people cease to believe in God, he had answered, they come to believe not in nothing, but in anything. For Abelson, God wasn't a belief so much as a defense mechanism against other, more frightening forms of belief. Also, he thought he had little to lose by believing in God. If the other side of death was, truly nothing, what did it matter if he believed? But if there was something on the other side, he had everything to gain. This was Abelson's logic of heaven. And now, gently, in the service of the present conversation, I reminded him of our previous one and its logic. Is it so bad, I asked, if some scientists want to play God with mice? You've said it yourself. We've got nothing to lose and everything to gain. Abelson brooded by the fire. In the weeks since I'd met him, it was the first time he'd seemed uncomfortable furthering an argument. Eventually, he rose from his seat. He announced it was time for him to make his way back to Halcyon. The evening had turned overcast. The thermometer dipped below freezing. I offered Abelson a thicker coat for his return. However, he declined. He passed through my front door and made fresh tracks home through a curtain of steadily falling snow. As I watched him go, his breath rose in a fine mist, crowning his head, and I marveled at his resilience to the cold.
So I want to ask one of these big questions now. Um, First of all, I'll say one of the things that is, from our vantage point, most novel about your novel is that people are reading things and expressions like above or below the fold make sense. Whereas your novel is everyone is very much on the apps and it's very digitally mediated in the way that things are now. But as you say in those few paragraphs, we were already aware in 2004 of the way that things were speeding up and the discourse was breaking down. Even people who were still reading the daily paper on paper. And my big question is, what do each of you think is the novels, this long work of prose on paper in our digitally mediated society?
That's a good question. um, I, I can answer what I love about novels and what I get from novels, and that is obviously there's new worlds to discover, there's new types of people you get to meet, there's new ideas you get to think about. But I like that novels remind me to feel things, and especially to feel things about people that I don't think I might ever meet. And I think that's especially in this world where I feel like we're more and more disconnected all the time. Loneliness is epidemic. People are, mental health is really bad. I feel like any kind of connection, anything that can help people connect or remember to feel or remember to seek connection is a service. So in that sense, I feel that's what I like to read about novels. And I hope that's the role that these novels can play, is reminding people that they should get out there and connect with some actual humans.
And I totally agree. I think that, I mean, what do novels do that other forms of storytelling don't do? You know, that a film doesn't necessarily do, or a great work of nonfiction doesn't do, although those two are obviously closer. I think there's like an interiority to novels that you don't get through other storytelling mechanisms, and there's like an intimacy that you, as the reader, feel with the author, even though you're just one of many readers, that I think helps with that type of loneliness. I also think my wife is a novelist. You know, we will sometimes talk about this, and I'm sort of always been of the opinion that like the death of the novel has been predicted for as long as there have been novels. You know, like radio, it's the end of the novel. You know, TV, why are you going to read these books? And you know, then it was ebooks, and like I feel like everybody, you know, at a certain level, we will always do this because of that, because once you've done it once and you've read a great book and you know what it feels like, you want to do it again, and you want to have that sense of being alone while not being alone, which is how I feel when I'm reading a really good book.
I love that about interiority too, because I can admit shamefully that sometimes I'm reading a book and I feel the tug of my phone. I want other voices, and then I remember that what I really like about a novel is it's just me.
Yeah.
It's just me
Yeah, right.
and that other writer. There's no one else's opinion there. Yeah. But I do. I think people say this all the time about, you know, when will the last novel be written?
Yeah.
But it is interesting how they change. I mean, I play that game a lot with my friends where we're like, would Virginia Woolf's novels be published today? Would Thomas Hardy get published today?
Yeah.
So I think, you know, the form persists, but the style changes a lot.
Yeah.
A very sort of structural basis that may be kind of writer craft talk, but I picked up on another similarity between these two novels, which is they have long chapters. They each, have somewhere in the range of like 6 to 10 long chapters instead of, and so much fiction these days is done in that sort of like fragmented and epigrammatic style, which seems maybe in part a response to the sense that people don't have the attention span anymore. And I was just curious, as a writer who tends to write long chapters as well, whether that was just the natural rhythm you fell into for this, or whether that was something you were conscious of doing.
I had just come off a project which was a kind of a military techno thriller that was very deliberately like 1,500 word chapters, no longer. And so I think maybe like my long chapters were like a little bit of a rebellion against that. If I'm going to just kind of stretch out here. But I don't know. I think it's more enjoyable to write long chapters.
Yeah, I feel like Hestia is a little, it does have a little bit of that fragmented feel, because even though there are only 7 chapters, it goes back and forth a lot. But for me, it was just the architecture was really simple. There's 7 boyfriends, 7 chapters. So that was a little bit of an easy decision to make that way. Yeah.
Another sort of craft question is, once you had decided you were doing this alternate history, you can sort of change anything, obviously. In your case, everything was really supposed to come out of this one thing, which was the Clinton resignation. But basically, the question then becomes, how much can I get away with changing and still have it feel like sort of recognizably the country we live in? How much do I need to change in order for it to feel like an alternate history? Where did you guys draw those lines on the things that kind of stayed the same and the things that didn't?
Well, in my case, I feel like it wasn't that hard. I didn't have to change that much to get us to civil war. We were already having, shootings, and are still having shootings all the time, which feel like terrorist acts. Arson, all sorts of, even lynching type events. So I don't think I had to really think too hard about that. But one thing I did have a lot of fun with was thinking about how the United States of America would be different once those 12 states seceded, and what things the United States could do that are good. And this was something my editor actually, we were having a conversation at one point during the revision, and she said, could you add in more of that stuff just to make it a little more fun? She called them Easter eggs. Can we have more of that where the United States gets rid of all the Supreme Court justices and starts over, where we pass, a national law protecting abortion? Can we have more of that fun stuff? And so we joked around a lot about what it's like when you lose weight, like when you lose that dead weight. So that, I did take some liberties there, but I felt like that helped make everything less grim in the book.
Yeah, I wanted the scope of the book not to be these externalities. Like it's, most of this stuff is happening sort of off stage. Once you're in this world of the alternate 2004, and like in Gore's president, it kind of looks a lot like 2004. And I think in this section I read, there's just like a couple brief things like the Clinton conviction, 9/11, Osama dragged out of his cave and killed. That's about it. I'm just letting you know that, in some ways things are better, in some ways things are worse. It's, America. It's America. It's always going to be a little bit of a mess. But then you're kind of taken into this world where, Robert Abelson is the protagonist now. He's come back and he has to try to bring himself up to speed. And he's reluctant at times to bring himself up to speed to this new world that he's living in. And for me, it sort of becomes a metaphor for anyone, maybe some of you out there who've, walked around in the last 5, 6, 7 years and it felt like you're sort of struggling to keep up as society kind of changes at ever increasingly speedy intervals. Yeah. So I know I've certainly had the experience. I mean, we were just talking about it when I was writing a piece for you. I was writing a piece for Harper's about the December 2019 runoff in Georgia. And I had come back and I was finishing the piece, and the editor I was working with called me on January 4th and was like, hey, Elliot, I live in half-time in New York and half-time in D.C. Elliot, are you in D.C. right now? I was like, no, I'm in New York and I'm busy and I got to file this piece for you. He's like, because there's supposed to be something going on in D.C. And I was like, it's not going to be anything. And I hung up. So, so I think that was a moment where I was, everyone's trying to keep up with what's going on in this country. And so the book is, in some ways, it's about trying to keep up.
Yeah. And without putting you too much on the spot on this, there's at least some suggestion that maybe the Gore administration should have been taking some of the bioethical questions a little more seriously. So it's not a George W. Bush, for these sort of religious reactionary reasons, shut down the stem cell research and shut down this, and now I'm imagining that instead we have the enlightened president who goes full steam ahead. You raise a lot of questions about that going full steam ahead.
Yeah, so, I think that when I'm writing a book like this, I don't think anybody actually cares what Elliot Ackerman thinks about these partisan issues. Like we live in America. Everyone has got their beliefs on every set of issue, and I'm not trying to convince anyone to decide one way or other. But you do have this cast of characters, and I feel like when each character steps onto the page, they're trying to make their case to the reader. So they're making their case before God. So you as a reader are going to be exposed to all these people and their beliefs. And so there is this contingent that you see the argument against this. And I think if I were to summarize that argument against bringing people back, it's the idea, to paraphrase Kafka, that the meaning of life is that it ends. And that, I think, is the meaning of life. If life didn't end, it wouldn't have any meaning. And so our deaths give us meaning, but also the deaths of certain ideas have meanings, and certain ideas are just meant to die. And so the novel it plays with all of those macro themes, as well as the micro themes of what's going on with a Confederate monument on the Gettysburg battlefield, or what's going on in a controversy in Abelson's in his legal history.
If I haven't yet convinced everyone that there's like a thematic mind meld going on here, that Kafka quote is in your book. Yeah.
That's right.
God, that's right.
Yeah, and I just to add on to what you said a little bit, that idea of, I have a lot of compassion for people who have a hard time with change, and I see it in your book, and I think I have it in mine, where it's sad, when change means loss, and you lose something when things change, and it's hard. And I think Abelson, we feel compassionately toward him in some way, and I feel compassionately toward the parents in this book. So
that comes through.
Yeah, you do a wonderful job with that, because it's all through Hestia as a narrator, and she doesn't feel compassion towards the parents, but you still allow the reader to feel this compassion sort of looking over her shoulder. Right. Yeah. I think it is time to open it up to audience questions if we have some. If you will raise your hand, then a microphone will be delivered to you. Can always rely on Phil Clay to be the
pedantic gentleman in the front.
How's it going? One of the things that I loved was you have this really big thing, which is we've brought people back from the dead, and you think it's going to go in one direction, but it goes into a dispute and over inheritance law, right? Which I thought was a really funny and really smart turn. It seemed like, unfortunately, I haven't read your book yet. It sounds wonderful. That there's what the big issues seem to be, and then the lived reality of the humans navigating it is going to take a totally different tack. And I wondered if you could talk a little bit about that turn that you make into that in the book, and why you made that decision plot-wise.
If I can, before you answer, just set you both up for that question, I would say, in addition, in your novel, as we've already said, it is about her dating life on these apps, and is also about sort of a kind of mundane living life within this, radically changed context. So anyway.
No, I would just, thanks for that, Phil. I would say it comes to what Christine said before, which is our need to have things be normal. Mm-hmm. I think as human beings, we have this incredible capacity, no matter how bad things are, no matter how, I think both of us are sort of dealing, these books were written at least partly during like pandemics. We think of everything we've lived through the last 5 years. I was just thinking as you were talking about, going into grocery stores with rubber gloves on and masks. I mean, and that was like totally normal, right? Or, we're sitting here today and we're talking about novels and literature, and I'm pretty sure there's probably a bunch of stories about how AI robots are about to take over the world. I mean, in this alternate 2004, yes, like we realize, kind of through these news stories that there's this prototype technology where we're going to be able to resuscitate people from the dead. I truly believe if that was announced tomorrow, like people would be like, okay, like I'll see you for dinner, but.
I say all the time about humans that we're so bad at so many things. Like we just can't do history, we can't really do math, we can't do big numbers or space or time, but we are really, really good at adapting and normalizing. And it's almost scary how good we are at it. And so I think, taking a really mundane thing like an inheritance law or a dating app. I mean, I don't know that it gets more boring than either of those things. And then just transposing that on something that should be horrific, but it just seems that everything will become normal because we're humans, and that's the thing we're good at. So.
Yeah. Not to take the side of Hestia's parents, but I also think, and I was reminded of this reading Elliot's book. I mean, we have been in emergency for 20 years. It's not the last 3 years of COVID. It's not the last 7 years since the 2016 election. It's basically since the Bush v. Gore or 9/11 or something like that. And there's only so long that you can live in an emergency before at some level you realize this is the one life I've got to live, and this is the time when I've got to live it in.
So what do we do? Yeah, you have to just keep going, right? You have to just keep going. I was talking with people the other night. While I was writing this, I had kids going to get their driver's licenses, going to prom, and all of that stuff is really meaningful and joyful, and none of that stops because you feel crazy, because of those Friday night news bursts from the White House.
More questions? There's one up here.
It's a question for both authors. Given that you were writing kind of alternate histories, but you both said that these were framed with things that were in our reality and just kind of taking maybe a step to the right or to the left and looking at it from a different angle, what was the greatest challenge you faced going through creating these worlds and doing the world building?
I think for me, I got ahead of myself a lot, so I wanted to write the story part, I wanted to write the characters and the plot, and I probably didn't have as clear an idea of the world that I was building. I had a half clear picture, so there were a couple of moments when I had to go back, okay, now I'll just type the 7-page document where I think through everything about this world, which feels like work because it doesn't feel as creative. So I had a lot of back and forth with that, where I kind of had a vision of how a scene would play out, but then I needed the receipts for how all of that was possible, so I would backtrack.
Well, the book's only been out a week, so I don't know if it really worked. But I think, having faith that the reader would kind of come with me, would be like, hey, listen, I'm telling you that people can come back from the dead, and I'm doing cryoregeneration, which, I get it as sort of like fringe and hokey, but I can't remember where I got this piece of writing advice or who said it, but the point was once made to me that the first 3 or 4 pages of a book, the reader's going to hang with you. No matter how wazoo it is, they're going to read it, and if you get to the end of 3 or 4 pages and you convince them to keep going, then you've got them and they'll be in your world. So for me, it was being all right, I can do a good enough job in these 3 or 4 pages to bring you into my world. And once I've got you, now, there's the Lazarus mice, and he's back from the dead, and they're arguing about what color Halcyon should be painted. Welcome to my weird world. So that for me was sort of having that faith.
Well, since you both read from your opening pages, I think one thing that I should be clear, but that I will say is they're both very voice-driven first-person books, and they do grab you right from the first page in terms of the authority of the books. And this is one where, having talked about all these similarities, they're utterly different voices. You know, yours is a comic voice that's sort of a bit of a manic comic, but cracking jokes all the time and very just sort of like witty and inviting in that way. And there's something sort of stately about yours, but he's a professional historian who writes about the Civil War, and it's done in this sort of stately prose, but with incredible authority. And I think that almost to me, more than anything about the building of the world, was just like when you get in it, you have a voice that's bringing you through as a remarkable achievement for both books.
Elliot, when you were talking, I was just thinking, how amazing is it that people will read 3 or 4 pages and be in the world? They'll just let themselves slip into that world. It's, I mean, with all the content out there that people will commit without even thinking about it. It's pretty amazing that we still do that.
It is. Yeah. I mean, you gotta have a good cover. But you gotta have a cover.
Well, mine is pink, and I
Yeah,
don't know
I
if
like
you've
the cover.
noticed, but
Yeah.
all the books that came out this spring are pink.
Or pink, yeah.
More questions?
About that cover, why is type wavy?
Because the world is sort of not exactly how it seems, if that makes sense. Anyways, that's why. Hope you can read it.
If there are no more questions, I am going to ask one more just because I've got you here and I'm curious. You mentioned these documents, sort of background documents. Books like this, there's a lot of continuity work you have to do. I wonder how much of that wound up on the page. That is to say, whether there's a lot of stuff that you each know about these respective worlds that we as the reader don't know, that you needed to know this in order to tell us what you told us, or whether everything you figured out got wound up in the book.
There's a lot that never made it onto the page. I have documents of secession, written by the NCSA, and I think maybe there's one sentence from that in the book. So yeah, there's a lot, probably for you too.
Yeah, I will find sometimes in my books there'll be like stories and conversations that I like to just sort of like I tell them and I'm saying them all the time because I like, there's a whole riff in this book about the Battle of Gettysburg that's, what happened at Gettysburg. And I would will tell that to my kids, and I'll bore anyone who will listen to me. And then at a certain point, it just sort of that riff, winds up into the book. So so for me, oftentimes it's, it's an accretion of just things I've kind of been picking up over the years that mature or they become ripe and they wind up in the story.
Well, thank you both very much. Yeah.
Thank you all. And so I know you're going to run by the books, so just go out the back doors and then come back through here to get them personalized. Thank you all so much for coming.